Swab their mouths, now. Do it before the funeral. Those were the first words Vivian Hale said to me after walking into my home. My husband, Nathan, had been dead for exactly 48 hours. I was sitting on the sofa staring at a wall while my 2 young children sat on the rug. They were dressed in small black outfits, quietly drawing pictures of a wooden box. They didn't fully understand that the box was their father's coffin. The room was deathly silent until Vivian marched in. She wasn't carrying flowers or food. She was holding a small white DNA kit like it was a weapon. She looked at my children with a coldness that made my skin crawl. "You will not bury my son under a lie, Alina," she said, her voice like cracking ice. I felt something inside me snap. The grief was still a heavy weight in my chest, making it hard to breathe, but her words acted like a spark. "What are you implying, Vivian?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on my daughter's face. "I am saying that those children may not be his. I am saying I want proof before his estate is settled." The air left my lungs. I looked around the room at the gathered relatives. No one spoke. No one defended me. This wasn't grief. It was a cold, calculated strategy. My name is Alina Hale, Alina Rowan before I married, and for 11 years I thought I was part of a family. I was married to Nathan Hale, a man who was kind, brilliant, and deeply loved by his children. But 48 hours after I became a widow, I realized I was actually a suspect in a crime I didn't commit. Vivian Hale, my mother-in-law, had never been a warm woman. She didn't cry at the hospital when the doctors told us Nathan had suffered a massive aneurysm. She didn't hug her grandchildren when they asked where their daddy went. While I was collapsing in the hospital hallway, overwhelmed by the sudden loss of my partner, Vivian was already looking at her watch. She didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, she asked one single, chilling question. "Where is the will?" I had ignored her then, thinking she was just in shock. I thought everyone processed death differently. But seeing her stand in my living room with that DNA kit changed everything. She wasn't in shock. She was in business mode. To her, Nathan wasn't a son who was gone. He was a set of assets that needed to be protected from outsiders like me and my children. I looked at the white box in her hand and realized that my mourning period was officially over. A war had just begun. Vivian didn't choose to confront me in private. That wasn't her style. She waited until my house was full of people, relatives, family friends, and high-level business associates from Hale Biotech. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me so deeply that I wouldn't have the strength to fight back. Standing in the center of the room, she raised the DNA kit for everyone to see. "If the children are legitimate, Alina, then you have absolutely nothing to fear," she announced loudly. The word legitimate hit me like a physical blow. She spoke about my son and daughter as if they were nothing more than pieces of paperwork or faulty products that needed to be returned. I looked at my son, who was quietly holding his father's silver watch in both of his small hands. He looked so much like Nathan, but Vivian refused to see it. "I will not traumatize my children to satisfy your cruel paranoia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Vivian didn't flinch. She just gave me a thin, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, this isn't paranoia. This is about inheritance." In that moment, the true motive stepped into the room. It wasn't about Nathan's memory or the truth. It was about the millions of dollars tied to the Hale name. If you believe no one should be humiliated like this, especially not 2 days after losing their husband, make sure you subscribe. This channel is for people who don't stay silent when they're pushed too far. To understand why Vivian was being so ruthless, you have to understand who Nathan was. He wasn't just my husband. He was the sole heir to Hale Biotech. It was a massive company founded by his father, Harold Hale, decades ago. The company was a giant in the medical world, and it was the source of the family's immense wealth and power. Vivian had run that company with ruthless precision for years, and she planned to keep it that way. In her mind, if my children weren't biological Hales, they would lose everything. They would lose their trust funds, their future shares in the company, and their voting rights on the board. If she could prove they weren't Nathan's, Vivian wouldn't just win a legal battle. She would gain total control over the entire empire. She wanted to cut us out of the family history as if we never existed. She viewed my children as obstacles to her absolute power. As I looked at her, I realized she had probably been planning this for a long time. She wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a CEO protecting her bottom line. She was willing to destroy her own grandchildren's lives just to make sure she held all the cards. I saw the greed in her eyes, and it was more terrifying than her anger. The pressure didn't stop after she left my house that day. The phone calls started almost immediately that night. It wasn't just Vivienne. It was other members of the family and their lawyers. "Just take the test, Alina," one aunt whispered over the phone. "Clear your name and get it over with." Another cousin called to say, "If you refuse, it only makes you look suspicious. Why hide it if you have nothing to hide?" They didn't care about my grief or the fact that I was trying to plan a funeral. They weren't worried about the truth. They were worried about the value of their shares. Vivienne had already contacted the family attorney before Nathan's body was even cold. She wanted the DNA results entered into the probate court records as soon as possible. She wanted it done before the funeral, before the burial, and before the earth even had a chance to cover Nathan's coffin. She was moving with a speed that was dizzying. I felt like I was being hunted. Everywhere I turned, there was a new demand or a new veiled threat. They wanted to strip me of my dignity before I even had a chance to say goodbye to my husband. It was a calculated campaign to break my spirit and force me to give up. As I sat in the dark of our bedroom that night, holding one of Nathan's shirts against my chest, a memory started to haunt me. The shirt still smelled like him, cedar and something warm and familiar, and I pressed my face into it and tried to hold the world together. I couldn't. During the last month of his life, Nathan had been different. He was distant and preoccupied. I remembered seeing him take late-night phone calls in the garden, his voice low and urgent. He would lock his office door, something he never used to do. Once, I walked into the room and he immediately stopped talking, snapping his laptop shut with a guilty look. At the time, I thought it was just work stress. Hale Biotech was always demanding. But now, I wondered if it was something else. However, there was one thing I was certain of. Never once did Nathan question our children. He adored them more than anything in the world. He was the kind of father who would get on the floor to play with blocks or stay up late reading bedtime stories. So why was his mother acting like he had secret doubts? Why was she claiming he wanted this test? It didn't add up. Unless this wasn't about Nathan at all. Unless Vivienne was using Nathan's death to cover up a secret of her own. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I realized that, to protect my kids, I had to look deeper into what Nathan was doing before he died. The day of the funeral was the hardest day of my life. I stood by the grave, holding my children's hands, feeling like the world was ending. Vivienne stood right beside me, dressed in perfect black silk. Her posture was stiff and her eyes were completely dry. She didn't look like a mother who had lost her only son. She looked like a queen attending a formal event. During the eulogy, she didn't talk about Nathan as a father or a husband. She referred to him as the last true Hale. She spoke about him as if he were a piece of property, an heir to a dynasty, rather than a human being with a heart. It was sickening. After the service, while guests were still lingering by the floral arrangements, she leaned close to my ear. The smell of her expensive perfume was suffocating. "Sign the consent forms for the DNA test by tomorrow morning, Alina," she whispered, her voice low and dangerous. "Or I will petition the court and make this a public scandal. I will drag your name through the mud until there is nothing left." She said this at my husband's grave while his body was being lowered into the ground. That was the moment my sadness turned into a cold, hard resolve. She wanted a fight? I would give her one. I held it together until the last guest left. I made sure the children had eaten something, brushed their teeth, and climbed into bed. I tucked them in, read 3 pages of a story I can't remember, kissed their foreheads, and closed the door behind me. And then I sat down on the floor of the hallway, right outside their room, and I fell completely apart. I didn't wail. I didn't want to wake them. It was a silent, suffocating kind of grief. I pressed my back against the wall and wrapped my arms around my knees and let the tears come until there was nothing left. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the house to go completely dark. At some point, I heard small footsteps. My daughter had gotten out of bed. She stood in front of me in her pajamas, holding her stuffed rabbit, looking at me with her father's eyes. She didn't say anything. She just sat down beside me, put her tiny head against my arm, and took my hand. We sat there together in the dark for a long time. She fell back asleep, leaning on me. And somewhere in that moment, I made a promise. Not to a court, not to a lawyer, not to Vivienne, but to her and her brother, and to Nathan. I promised I would not let them be erased. By Monday morning, the threats became official. Her high-priced lawyer sent an email to mine with a formal demand for DNA verification. They had already prepared a motion to freeze the estate's assets until the results were filed. It was a legal chokehold. I sat in my lawyer's office, looking at the documents, and the full weight of it hit me for the first time. My lawyer didn't soften it. In a worst-case scenario, he said carefully, a successful challenge to the children's paternity could affect not just the inheritance, but your standing as sole custodial decision-maker over their assets. And depending on how aggressively she pushes, she could argue for grandparental involvement in major decisions. I stared at him. Are you telling me she could take my children? He hesitated. Not physically. But she could make your life very difficult. These things can drag on for years. I drove home in a cold, hollow silence. For the first time since Vivienne had walked into my living room with that DNA kit, I felt something worse than anger. I felt genuine fear. I thought about my daughter's hand in mine in the hallway the night before. I thought about my son carrying his father's watch. I realized there was nothing I would not do to protect them, and then a thought cut through the fear, sharp and clear. Vivienne was so focused on my children's DNA because she thought it was my only weakness. She didn't realize that DNA works both ways. I called Vivienne's lawyer back and told them I agreed to the test. I could almost hear the smug satisfaction through the phone when they relayed the news to her. But I had one condition. I would choose the lab, and the testing would be comprehensive. Vivienne agreed without asking for details. She just wanted the swabs and assumed she was getting a standard paternity report. She had no idea I was ordering something far more extensive. I requested a full lineage analysis and a comprehensive ancestry marker report, one that would trace not just who the father was, but the entire generational comparison of the Hale family. Crucially, Harold Hale had submitted a personal DNA sample to the company's executive medical archive years before his death, a common practice among large estate holders for succession and insurance purposes. And because Nathan had died in hospital following a medical emergency, biological samples had been retained as part of the standard postmortem process. I authorized their release to the lab, giving the testing team everything they needed for a complete cross-generational analysis. That combination of samples made the comparison possible in a way Vivienne never anticipated. I wanted to see how my children's DNA mapped out across the whole family tree. Vivienne thought she was testing me, but I was actually testing her. I was going to use the same weapon she aimed at my children to look into the history of the mighty Hale bloodline she was so proud of. If she wanted to talk about purity and legitimacy, we were going to look at everyone's records. She was trying to erase my children from their own family. So I decided I would expose whatever secrets she was trying so hard to protect. The day the lab technician came to the house was heartbreaking. My children didn't understand why they had to have their mouths rubbed with plastic sticks. They cried, confused and scared, still reeling from the loss of their father. I held them tight, whispering that everything would be okay, even though my own heart was breaking. Watching them go through that because of their grandmother's greed made my blood boil. I felt a fire lighting up inside me that I hadn't felt before. Vivienne was a powerful woman, but she had underestimated a mother's instinct to protect her young. As the technician packed up the samples, I knew there was no turning back. The results would take about 10 days to process. Those 10 days felt like a lifetime. I spent every night awake, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But then I would look at my children sleeping and remember Vivienne's cold face at the funeral. I knew I couldn't let her win. If the Hale legacy was built on the idea of superior blood, then I was going to find out exactly what that blood was made of. I was done being a victim of her strategy. It was time to find out what Nathan had been so worried about in his final weeks. While I waited for the DNA results, I started doing some digging of my own. I went through Nathan's personal computer and his bank statements from the last few months. That's when I found it. A massive transfer of money. 3 weeks before he died, Nathan had moved a huge sum into a private holding trust. My breath caught when I saw the name of the trustee, Vivian Hale. He had never mentioned this to me. Why would he give her that much control over his personal funds so suddenly? It didn't make sense. Nathan loved his mother, but he didn't always trust her business ethics. The more I looked, the more I saw a pattern of Vivian tightening her grip on him. There were emails from her that were almost threatening, telling him to do what is necessary for the family. It looked like she had been bullying him into giving her more power over the company and his own estate. The stress must have been unimaginable. I had read enough about aneurysms in the days since Nathan died to know they could be triggered by extreme, prolonged stress. My stomach dropped as I realized that Vivian might have been the one who pushed him over the edge. She hadn't just ignored his death. She might have contributed to the conditions that caused it. I found something even more suspicious in a hidden folder on Nathan's laptop. There were 2 things inside it. The first was a draft for a new will, unsigned and unfiled, that would have stripped me of guardianship control over the children's inheritance and handed enormous power to Vivienne. The timestamp showed it was created 4 days before he died. He had clearly been pressured to sign it and had refused, but it was the second file that stopped my heart. It was a draft email, never sent, addressed to a private attorney Nathan had found independently, outside of any Hale family connection. The subject line was, "Urgent, paternity matter, confidential." I read it 3 times, my hands shaking harder with each pass. Nathan had ordered his own private DNA tests 6 weeks before his death. He had sent a saliva sample to a third-party genetic lab under a false name. The preliminary results had come back 3 weeks later, and they had shattered everything he thought he knew about himself. He wrote that he believed he was not Harold Hale's biological son. He wrote that he suspected his mother had known for decades. And then, in the final paragraph, the words that broke me open completely. "She will do anything to keep this buried. I have tried to talk to her, and she denied everything, then threatened the company, the trust funds, and our family's standing if I pursued it further. I am afraid of what she might do when she finds out I know for certain. But I cannot live with this lie. I need your guidance on how to come forward without destroying what my father, the man who raised me, built." He had signed it simply, Nathan. He had been trying to do the right thing. He had been trying to tell the truth. And the weight of fighting her alone, of carrying that secret while she bullied and threatened him, had killed him before he ever got the chance. A few days later, I received a private call from Nathan's neurologist. He explained that he had wanted to contact me sooner, but the hospital's ethics and legal teams had required him to go through a formal process before disclosing information about a deceased patient to anyone other than next of kin. A process Vivian had complicated by asserting her own rights as Nathan's mother. Once the hospital confirmed I was the primary next of kin, he was cleared to speak. He sounded relieved to finally do so. "Alina, I felt I should tell you," he said carefully. "During Nathan's last checkup, I noticed signs of extreme prolonged stress. His blood pressure was dangerously high, which was unusual for him. I asked him if he knew what was causing it. The doctor sighed. He didn't go into details, but he mentioned family pressures regarding the company. He seemed trapped." My heart sank. The draft email confirmed what the doctor was describing. Nathan hadn't just been under stress, he had been carrying a secret that could blow up his entire world, while the person who put it there threatened him into silence. Vivian hadn't just been a cold mother-in-law, she had been a predator. She had squeezed her own son for power until his body couldn't take it anymore. The massive aneurysm wasn't just a random medical event. It was the result of a life lived under Vivian's thumb. I thanked the doctor and hung up, my hands shaking. I looked at the photos of Nathan on the mantel. He looked so happy in them, but I could see the hidden tension in his eyes in the more recent ones. He had tried to be brave. He had tried to be honest, and it had cost him everything. I decided to confront Vivian. I went to her office at Hale Biotech, a place that felt more like a fortress than a place of business. She sat behind a massive mahogany desk, looking as unbothered as ever. When I threw the bank statements, the draft will, and a printout of Nathan's unsent email on her desk, something flickered across her face, just for a moment. Not guilt. Not remorse. Fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of cold control. She didn't deny any of it. She just leaned back and looked at me with those calculating eyes. "Power requires hard decisions, Alina," she said, her voice completely flat. Nathan was too soft. He didn't understand what it took to keep this empire together. I was simply trying to ensure the future of the Hales. I told her that her hard decisions had killed her son. She didn't blink. He had a medical condition. It was unfortunate timing. But the company must go on. She spoke about her son's death as if it were a minor inconvenience. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something that was almost a whisper. "Whatever you think you've found, Alina, be very careful. You are one woman with 2 small children and no income. I am this company, and I will make sure every court, every journalist, and every person in this city knows exactly the kind of woman you are." I held her gaze for a long moment. Then I stood up, gathered my papers, and walked out. She had just shown me exactly how afraid she was. Before we open that envelope, if you want more real stories where the truth fights back, hit subscribe now. Because what happens next, she never saw it coming. The results arrived on a Thursday. Vivian had arranged for them to be opened at Hale Biotech. Her conference room, her board members, her witnesses. She had designed every detail of this moment. She had even chosen where I would sit, directly across from her, in full view of everyone. When I walked in, the room went quiet. I could feel the eyes. Board members who had never looked at me twice were now studying my face like they were searching it for guilt. Vivian was already seated at the head of the table. She wasn't looking at the envelope in the center of the table. She was looking at me. And she was almost smiling. I understood then what she had done. She had previewed the lab's preliminary notification. The first page only, the paternity portion. And she believed she already knew the ending. This was a victory ceremony. She had invited an audience to watch me be destroyed. What she didn't know was that I had ordered a second analysis, that the consent form her lawyers had signed without reading had authorized a full lineage comparison, that the envelope on the table contained much more than she expected. I sat down. I folded my hands. I waited. The lawyer opened the envelope and read the first page. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. He didn't need to explain what it meant. The number hung in the air. My children were Nathan's. They always had been. I didn't cry. I didn't exhale. I just looked at Vivian. Her jaw had gone tight. A flush was spreading up her neck. She had just been proven wrong in front of every person whose opinion mattered to her, and she knew it. One board member looked down at the table. Another shifted in his seat. The room had the particular silence of people who have realized they chose the wrong side. Vivian recovered fast. That was her gift. "Well," she said, clipping each word short, "at least we have clarity. We can move forward." She reached for the documents. Her hand was steady. Her eyes were not. I put my hand on the papers before she could take them. "There is a second page," I said. I slid the second page to the lawyer. "Read the lineage comparison," I said. He looked at it. Something changed in his face. A quick, involuntary stillness, like a man who has just realized he is holding something dangerous. He glanced at Vivienne. She was watching him. Her chin was lifted. Her expression said, "Go ahead, read it. This is over." He cleared his throat. "The genetic comparison between Nathan Hale and the paternal lineage of Harold Hale shows a biological link of 0%. Nobody moved. I don't think anyone breathed. Then someone whispered something to the person next to them, and that whisper became another, and the room fractured into noise. 0%. Harold Hale. The man whose name was on the building, whose portrait hung in the lobby, whose blood Vivian had spent 30 years claiming to protect, was not Nathan's father. Which meant Nathan was not a Hale by blood. which meant that everything Vivienne had built her identity around, every lecture about loyalty and lineage and legacy, every act of cruelty she had committed in the name of the bloodline, all of it was built on a lie she had told before Nathan could even speak. I watched Vivienne's face in the seconds after the lawyer stopped reading. I had expected rage. What I saw was worse. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. The color left her face so completely that she looked like a different person, older, smaller, stripped of the armor she had worn every day of her life. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge. "That's impossible," she said. "Just that. Not a threat, not a strategy, a whisper." She said it to no one in particular, like a woman arguing with a mirror. Around her, the room was pulling apart. Board members were leaning into each other, speaking in low, urgent voices. One stood up and walked to the corner of the room with his phone. Another was already typing something with shaking hands. None of them were looking at Vivienne anymore. That was what seemed to reach her. Not the science, not the number, but the moment she looked up and realized that the people who had deferred to her for decades were no longer paying attention to her at all. "The lab made a mistake," she said. Her voice was louder now, a little desperate. "This is a trick." Nobody answered her. I looked at Vivienne across that table, and I thought about Nathan. Not the legal version of him, the heir, the asset, the son she had used and pressured and ultimately broken. The real version, the man who had sat alone in his office 6 weeks before his death and drafted a letter he was too afraid to send. Who had written, in his own handwriting, "I cannot live with this lie." Who had tried, quietly and alone, to find a way to bring the truth into the light without destroying the man who raised him. He had discovered what she was. He had confronted her, and she had threatened him, with the company, the trust funds, the family name, everything. Until the weight of carrying her secret, while fighting her silence, had broken his body. He had died still trying to find the courage. She had spent those same 6 weeks calling me a fraud, circling my children, preparing to erase them from the family history. And now here she sat, in the room she had ruled for 30 years, watching her own lie come apart in front of every person who had ever believed her. The truth she had buried had come back, and it had come back for her. The room dissolved around her. People stood. Phones came out. Voices collided over each other. Not at her, just past her, around her, as if she were already a piece of furniture. I wasn't listening to any of it. I was watching her. She sat very still. Her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the space in front of her where people had been before they stopped looking at her and started looking at each other. One of her longest-serving board allies, a man I had seen defer to her in meetings for years, walked behind her chair without acknowledgement. Didn't touch her shoulder, didn't meet her eye, just walked past her and out of the room. That was the moment, I think, not the number on the page. That moment, when the person who had given her the most of his loyalty walked out without looking back. Her hands stayed flat on the table. The room kept moving, and Vivienne sat in the middle of it, perfectly still, absolutely alone. I didn't stay to watch the rest of it. I picked up my bag, walked out of the conference room, took the elevator down to the lobby, and pushed through the front doors into the cold air outside. I stood on the pavement for a moment. A normal Thursday afternoon. People walking past, a man walking a dog, a woman on her phone. None of them had any idea what had just happened on the 14th floor. I stood there and breathed. My lawyer called within the hour. He talked. I listened. I said thank you. I hung up. Then I sat in my car in the parking structure and thought about Nathan. His unsent email had been submitted into the court record that morning. It would sit there permanently, his words, in his voice, saying what he had known and what he had tried to do. When his children were old enough, they could read it. They would know their father had been brave. That mattered more to me than any of the rest of it. I was wrong to think the collapse would be quiet. Vivienne didn't surrender. She detonated. Within 48 hours of the board meeting, her lawyers filed an emergency petition for grandparental custody involvement, claiming I was emotionally unstable and potentially unfit to act in the children's best interests following Nathan's death. It was the cruelest thing she had ever done, weaponizing my grief, labeling my mourning as madness, and trying to use the legal system to reach inside my home and take my children. The same week, stories began appearing in tabloids. Anonymous sources described me as a gold digger who had trapped Nathan into marriage. One article included private details about our relationship that only someone close to the family could have known. A private investigator began following me. I noticed the same car parked near the school twice in 3 days. And then one afternoon I arrived to collect the children and found Vivian already there, standing at the school gates, telling my son she had come to take him for a special lunch. The school called me immediately. I was there within 7 minutes. I stood between her and my children, and I did not move. She looked at me with those cold eyes and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "I will never stop, Alina. Not ever." That night, after the children were in bed, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. My hands were shaking. My lawyer had told me the custody petition had no real merit, but it would cost money to fight, take months to resolve, and be emotionally exhausting in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. I was already so tired. I thought about calling him and asking what it would take to negotiate a settlement, to make it quiet, to make it end. I sat with that thought for a long time. Then I opened Nathan's laptop. I don't know why, habit, maybe, or longing. I navigated back to the hidden folder. I read his unsent email again, slowly, all the way to the end. I cannot live with this lie. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark and thought about who Nathan was. He was a man who had discovered something that could have destroyed his world, and instead of burying it, he had tried to find a way to bring it into the light safely. He hadn't acted out of vengeance. He had acted out of conscience. He had been afraid and exhausted and trapped, and he had still tried to do the right thing. If I settled, I would be doing what Vivian had spent 30 years doing, choosing the easier lie over the harder truth. And I would be teaching my children, Nathan's children, that the truth is only worth fighting for until it gets inconvenient. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. In the morning, I called my lawyer and told him we were not negotiating anything. We were going to fight every single petition, motion, and claim she filed, and we were going to win. Vivian's counterattack fell apart piece by piece. The grandparental custody petition was dismissed within 3 weeks. The judge ruled it had no evidentiary basis and noted pointedly that the filing appeared to be a tactical maneuver rather than a genuine welfare concern. The tabloid stories dried up once my lawyer sent formal letters to 3 publications threatening defamation suits. The private investigator disappeared. The school incident had been logged and witnessed, which meant any further attempt by Vivian to access my children without permission would carry legal consequences. She had tried every weapon she had. None of them had worked. The testing company stood firmly by their results, releasing a verified statement that made Vivian's tampering claims look hollow. Even her own lawyers began quietly distancing themselves. The woman who had marched into my home to demand a DNA test was now hiding behind closed doors, terrified of the very thing she had unleashed. The truth wasn't her friend anymore. It was her executioner. The board voted a few days later. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. My lawyer called me afterwards and spoke for about 4 minutes. The core of it was simple. Her authority was gone. Her voting rights, her position, her access to the trusts she had spent 30 years controlling, suspended, pending a full investigation into how she had originally represented the family's lineage when those documents were filed. My children were protected. That was all I had ever needed to hear. She was escorted out of the building that same afternoon. I was told she didn't speak to anyone on the way out. She walked through the lobby she had commanded for decades, past the portrait of Harold Hale on the wall, past the reception desk where people had once stood up when she entered, and out through the front doors. Nobody walked her to her car. Nobody said goodbye. The woman who had marched into my home to strip my children of everything walked out of her own empire with nothing. She had aimed the truth like a weapon, and it had turned around and taken everything from her instead. The story eventually leaked to the public, and the fallout was massive. Headlines across the country questioned the entire Hale legacy. The stock prices for Hale Biotech dipped as investors worried about stability. Vivienne's carefully curated image as a pillar of the community was shattered beyond repair. She became a cautionary tale about greed and deception. She avoided cameras and stayed locked inside her mansion, refusing to talk to the press or even her former friends. She especially avoided me. For the first time since Nathan died, she had nothing to say. There were no more demands, no more threats, and no more cold smiles. She was just a lonely woman, sitting in a big empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of her lies. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt since the moment Nathan passed away. The war was over. My children were safe, and their father's memory had been not just defended but honored. He had tried to be truthful, and the record now said so. We could finally begin to grieve, properly, quietly, without the shadow of her greed hanging over us. Weeks later, I stood in that same conference room at Hale Biotech. But this time, I wasn't the suspect. I had been granted temporary guardianship of my children's shares and invited to join the board oversight committee. I didn't want the empire or the power. I only wanted protection for my kids and to ensure the company was run with the honesty Nathan had tried so hard to bring to it. I thought about him a lot in those weeks. Not the legal version of him, the heir, the asset, the last true Hale, but the real version. The man who sat on the floor with our kids and read bedtime stories and laughed with his whole face. The man who had found an unbearable truth and tried, quietly and alone, to do the right thing with it. He hadn't made it, but I had. And my children would grow up knowing who he really was. Not the version Vivienne tried to carve into stone, but the whole, true, complicated, brave version. The one who loved them, the one who tried to protect them, even when it cost him everything. As I looked out the window at the city, I realized the only thing that had ever made any of this possible was something Vivienne had never understood and never would. The truth. Not power. Not money. Not bloodlines or legacy or the right last name. Just the truth. We walked away from the ruins of her empire not just vindicated, but free. And I knew, finally, deeply, in a way I could carry forward, that Nathan was at rest. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. There is another one waiting on your screen right now.